Hello, welcome to my channel, Library by Anne van Hofstadter. I'm reading my books online so I can share my collection of classic books. Please remember, English is my second language. This channel is dedicated to less fortunate readers who, for whatever reason, cannot afford to buy a classic book. Before we start, please tell me if you have an easy access to good books. Do you have a home library? Are you using your city library? Please leave your comments below. Now, let us continue. We are going to read The Mysterious Affair at Styles by Agatha Christie, Chapter 6, The Inquest. In the interval before the inquest, Poirot was unfailing in his activity. Twice he was closeted with Mr. Wells. He also took long walks into the country. I rather resented his not taking me into his confidence, the more so as I could not in least guess what he was driving at. It occurred to me that he might have been making inquiries at Raikes' farm. So, finding him out when I called at Listway's cottage on Wednesday evening, I walked over there by the fields, hoping to meet him. But there was no sign of him, and I hesitated to go right up to the farm itself. As I walked away, I met an aged rustic who leered at me cunningly. "You're from the Hall, ain't you?" he asked. "Yes, I'm looking for a friend of mine whom I thought might have walked this way. A little chap as waves his hands when he talks. One of them Belgies from the village?" "Yes," I said eagerly. "He has been here since then?" "Oh, he's been here, right enough. More once too." "A friend of yours, is he? Ah, you gentlemen from the Hall. Pretty lot." And he leered more jocosely than ever. "Why do the gentlemen from the Hall come here often?" I asked as carelessly as I could. He winked at me knowingly. "One does, mister," naming no names, and mine, "and a very liberal gentleman too." "Oh, thank you, sir, I am sure." I worked on sharply. Evelyn Howard had been right then, and I experienced a sharp twinge at disgust as I thought of Alfred Ingelthorp's liberality with another woman's money. Had that piquant, tipsy face been at the bottom of the crime? Or was it a baser mainspring of money? Probably a judicious mixture of both. On one point, Poirot seemed to have curious obsession. He once or twice observed to me that he thought Dorcas must have made an error in fixing the time of the quarrel. He suggested to her repeatedly that it was 4:30 and not 4 o'clock when she had heard the voices. But Dorcas was unshaken. Quite an hour, or even more, had elapsed between the time when she had heard the voices and 5 o'clock, when she had taken tea to her mistress. The inquest was held on Friday at Stylet's Arm in the village. Perrault and I sat together, not being required to give evidence. The preliminaries were gone through. The jury viewed the body, and John Cavendish gave evidence of identification. Further question, he described his awakening in the early hours of the morning and the circumstances of his mother's death. The medical evidence was was next taken, there was a breathless hush, and every eye was fixed on the famous London specialist, who was known to be one of the greatest authorities of the day on the subject of toxicology. In a few brief words, he summed up the result of the post-mortem, shown of it medical physiology and the technicalities. It amounted to the fact that Mrs. Ingelthorp had met her death as a result of strychnine poisoning. Judging from the quantity recovered, she must have taken not less than three quarters of a grain of strychnine, but probably 1 grain or slightly over. But it is possible that she could have swallowed the poison by accident, asked the coroner. I should consider it very unlikely. Strychnine is not used for domestic purposes, as some poisons are, and there are restrictions placed on its sale. Does anything in your examination lead you to determine how the poison was administered? No. You arrived at Styles before Dr. Wilkins, I believe. That is so. The met me just outside the lodge gates, and I hurried there as fast as I could. Were you relayed to us exactly what happened next? I entered Mrs. Inglethorpe's room. She was at that moment in a typical Titanic convulsion. She turned upwards me and gasped up, Alfred, Alfred. Could the strychnine have been administered in Mrs. Inglethorpe's after dinner coffee, which was taken to her by her husband? Possibly, but strychnine is a fairly rapid drug in its action. The symptoms appear from 1 to 2 hours after it has been swallowed. It is retarded under certain conditions, none of which, however, appear to have been present in this case. I presume Mrs. Inglethorpe took the coffee after dinner about 8 o'clock, whereas the symptoms did not manifest themselves until the early hours of the morning, which, on the face of it, points to the drug having been taken much later in the evening. Mrs. Inglethorpe was in the habit of drinking a cup of cocoa in the middle of the night. Could the strychnine have been administered in that? No. I myself took a sample of the cocoa remaining in the saucepan and had it analyzed. There was no strychnine present. I heard Poirot chuckle softly beside me. How did you know? I whispered. Listen. I should say, the doctor was continuing, that I would have been considerably surprised at any other result. Why? Simply because strychnine has an unnatural bitter taste. It can be detected in a solution of 1 in 7,000 and can only be disguised by some strongly flavored substance. Cocoa would be quite powerless to mask it. One of the jury wanted to know if the same objection applied to the coffee. No, coffee has a bitter taste of its own, which would probably cover the taste of the strychnine. Then you consider it more likely that the drug was administered in the coffee, but that for some unknown reason its action was delayed. Yes, but the cup being completely smashed, there is no possibility of analyzing its contents. This concluded Dr. Bowersten's evidence. Dr. Wilkins corroborated it all on all points, sounded as to the possibility of suicide. He repudiated it utterly. The deceased, he said, suffered from a weak heart, but otherwise enjoyed perfect health and was of a cheerful and very well balanced disposition. She would be one of the last people to take her own life. Lawrence Cavendis was next called. His evidence was quite unimportant, being a mere repetition of that of his brother. Just as he was about to step down, he paused and said rather hesitatingly, I should like to make a suggestion, if I may. He glanced deprecatingly at the coroner, who replied briskly, "Certainly, Mr. Cavendish, we are here to arrive at the truth of this matter, and welcome anything that may lead to further elucidation." "It is just an idea of mine," explained Lawrence. "Of course, I should be quite, I may be quite wrong, but it still seems to me that my mother's death might be accounted by the natural means." "How do you make that out, Mr. Cavendish?" "My mother, at the time of her death, and some time before, was taking a tonic containing strychnine." "Ah," said the coroner. A jury looked up, interested. "I believe," continued Lawrence, "that there have been cases where the cumulative effect of a drug administered for some time has ended by causing death. Also, it is not possible that she may have taken an overdose of her medicine by accident. This is the first we have heard of the deceased taking strychnine at the time of her death. We are much obliged to you, Mr. Cavendish." Dr. Wilkins was recalled and ridiculed the idea. "What Mr. Cavendish suggests is quite impossible. Any doctor would tell you the same. Strychnine is, in a certain sense, a cumulative poison, but it would be quite impossible for it to result in a sudden death in this way. There would have been a long period of chronic symptoms, which would at once have attracted my attention. The whole thing is absurd." The second suggestion, that Mrs. Ingelthorp may have inadvertently taken an overdose, three or even four doses, would not have resulted in death. Mrs. Inglethorpe's always had an extra large amount of medicine made up at the time, as she dealt with Coots, the cash chemist in Tadminster. She would have had to take very nearly the whole bottle to account for the amount of strychnine found in the post mortem. Then you consider that we may dismiss the tonic as not being in any way instrumental in causing her death? Certainly, the supposition is ridiculous. The same juryman who had interrupted before here suggested that the chemist who made up the medicine might have committed an error. "That, of course, is always possible," replied the doctor. But Dorcas, who was the next witness called, dispelled even that possibility. The medicine had not been newly made up. On the contrary, Mrs. Inglethorpe had taken the last dose on the day of her death. So the question of the tonic was finally abandoned, and the coroner proceeded with his task, having elicited from Dorcas how she had been awakened by the violent ringing of her mistress' bell, and had subsequently aroused the household. He passed to the subject of the quarrel on the preceding afternoon. Dorcas' evidence on his point was substantially what Poirot and I already heard, so I will not repeat it here. The next witness was Mary Cavendish. She stood very upright and spoke in a low voice, clear and perfectly composed voice. In answer to the coroner's question, she told how her alarm clock, having aroused her at 4:30, as usual, she was dressing when she was startled by the sound of something heavy falling. "That would have been the table by the bed," commented the coroner. "I opened my door," continued Mary, "and listened. In a few minutes a bell rang violently. Dorcas came running down and woke my husband, and we all went to my mother's in law's room, but it was locked." The coroner interrupted her. "I really do not think we need to trouble you further on that point. We know all that can be known of the subsequent happenings, But I should be obliged if you would tell us all you overheard of the quarrel the day before. I? There was a faint insolence in her voice. She raised her hand and adjusted the ruffle of her lace at her neck, turning her head a little as she did so. And quite spontaneously, the thought flashed across my mind: she is gaining time. Yes, I understand, continued the coroner deliberately, that you were sitting reading in the bench just outside the long window of the boudoir. That it is so, is it not? This was not news to me, and glancing sideways at Poirot, I fancied that it was news to him as well. There was a faintest pause, the mere hesitation of the moment before she answered, "Yes, that is so." And the boudoir window was open, was it not? Surely her face grew a little paler as she answered, "Yes." Then you cannot have failed to hear the voices inside, especially as they were raised in anger. In fact, they were more audible where you were than in the hall. Possibly. Will you repeat to us what you overheard of the quarrel? I really do not remember hearing anything. Do you mean to say you did not hear voices? Oh, yes, I heard the voices, but I did not hear what they said. A faint spot of color came into her cheek. I am not in the habit of listening to private conversations, the coroner persisted. And you remember nothing at all? Nothing. Mrs. Cavendish? Not one stray word or phrase to make you realize that it was a private conversation? She paused and seemed to reflect, still outwardly as calm as ever. Yes, I remember. Mrs. Ingelthorp said something. I do not remember exactly what about causing a scandal between husband and wife. Ah, the coroner leant back satisfied. That corresponded with what Dorcas heard. But excuse me, Mrs. Cavendish, although you realize it was a private conversation, you did not move away? You remained where you were? I caught the momentary gleam of her tawny eyes as she raised them. I felt certain that at that moment she would willingly have turned the little lawyer, with his insinuations, into pieces, but she replied quietly enough. No, I was very comfortable where I was. I fixed my mind on my book, and that is all you can tell us. That is all. The examination was over, though I doubted if the coroner was entirely satisfied with it. I think he suspected that Mary Cavendish could tell more of if she chose. Amy Hill, shop assistant, was next called and disposed to having sold a will form on the afternoon of the 17th to William Earl, under gardener at Styles. William Earl and Manning succeeded her and testified to witnessing a document. Manning fixed the time at about 4:30. William was of the opinion it was rather earlier. Cynthia Murdoch came next. She had, however, little to tell. She had known nothing of the tragedy until awakened by Mrs. Cavendish. You did not hear the table fell? No, I was fast asleep. Coroner smiled. A good conscience makes a good sound sleeper, he observed. Thank you, Miss Murdoch, that is all. Miss Howard? Miss Howard produced a letter written to her by Mrs. Ingelthorp on the evening of the 17th. Poirot and I had, of course, already seen it. It added nothing to our knowledge of the tragedy. On the opposite page is a facsimile. It was handed to the jury to scrutinize it attentively. I fear it does not help us much, said the coroner, with a sigh. There is no mention of any of the events that afternoon. Plain as a pig stuff to me, said Miss Howard shortly. It shows clearly enough that my poor old friend had just found out she's been made a fool of. It says nothing of the kind in the letter, the coroner pointed out. No, because Emily never could bear to put herself in the wrong. But I know her. She wanted me back, but she wasn't going to own that. I've been right. She went roundabout. Most people do. Don't believe in it myself. Mr. Wells smiled faintly, so I noticed it. I noticed. Did several of the jury. Miss Howard was obviously quite a public character. My dear Evelyn, can you bury the hatchets? I found it hard to process. Well, things you said to my husband, but I am an old woman, very fond of you. Yours, affectionately, Emily Ingelthorp. Anyway, all this tomfoolery is a great waste of time, continued the lady, glancing up and down the jury despairingly. Talk, 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 when all the time we know perfectly well. The coroner interrupted her in agony of apprehension. Thank you, Miss Howard. That is all. I fancied to breathe a sigh of relief when she complied. Then came the sensation of the day. The coroner called Albert Mays, chemist's assistant. It was our agitated young man of the face. In answer to the coroner's questions, he explained that he was a qualified pharmacist, but had only recently come to this particular shop, as the assistant formerly there had just been called up for the army. These preliminaries completed, the coroner proceeded to the business. Mr. Mays, have you lately sold strychnine to any unauthorized person? Yes, sir. When was this? Last Monday night. Monday? Not Tuesday? No, sir. Monday, the 16th. Will you tell us to whom you sold it? You could have heard pin drop. Yes, sir. It was Mr. Ingelthorp. Every eye turned simultaneously to where Alfred Ingelthorp was sitting, impassive and wooden. He started slightly as the damning words fell from the young man's lips. I half thought he was going to rise from his chair, but he remained seated, although a remarkably well acted expression of astonishment rose in his face. You are sure of what you say? Asked the coroner sternly. Quite sure, sir. Are you in the habit of selling strychnine discriminately over the counter? The rich young man wilted visibly under the coroner's frown. Oh, no, sir, of course not. By seeing it was Mr. Inglethorpe's of the Hall, I thought there was no harm in it. He said it was to poison the dog. Inwardly, I sympathized. It was only human nature to endeavor to please the Hall, especially when it might result in custom being transferred from goods to the local establishment. It is not customary for anyone purchasing poison to sign a book. Yes, sir. Mr. Inglethorpe did so. Have you got the book here? Yes, sir. It was produced, and with a few words of stern censure, the coroner dismissed the wrench, Mr. Mays. Then, amidst a breathless silence, Alfred Inglethorpe was called. Did he realize, I wondered, how closely the halter was being drawn around his neck? The coroner went to the point. On Monday evening last, did you purchase strychnine for the purpose of poisoning a dog? Engeltorf replied with a perfect calmness. No, I did not. There is no dog at Styles, except an outdoor sheepdog, which is in perfect health. You deny absolutely having purchased strychnine from Albert Mays on Monday last? I do. Do you also deny this? The coroner handed him the register in which his signature was inscribed. Certainly I do. The handwriting is quite different from mine. I will show you. He took an old envelope out of his pocket and wrote his name in it, handing it to the jury. It was certainly utterly dissimilar. Then what is your explanation of Mr. May's statement? Engelthorpe replied imperturbably. Mr. Mays must have been mistaken. The coroner hesitated for a moment, then said, Mr. Ingelthorpe, as a mere matter of form, would you mind telling us where you were in the evening of the Monday night, July the 16th? Really, I cannot remember. That is absurd, Mr. Ingelthorpe, said the coroner sharply. Think again. Ingelthorpe shook his head. I cannot tell you. I have an idea that I was out walking. In what direction? I really can't remember. The coroner's face grew graver. Were you in a company with anyone? No. Did you meet anyone on your walk? No. That is a pity, said the coroner dryly. I am to take it, then, that you declined to say where you were at the time that Mr. Mays positively recognized you as entering the shop to purchase strychnine. If you like to take it that way, yes. Be careful, Mr. Inglethorpe. Poirot was fidgeting nervously. Sacre, he murmured. Does this imbecile of a man want to be arrested? Inglethorpe was indeed creating a bad impression. His futile denials would have convinced the child. The coroner, however, passed briskly to the next point, and Poirot drew a deep breath of relief. You had a discussion with your wife on Tuesday afternoon. Pardon me? Interrupted Uncle Alfred Inglethorpe. You have been misinformed. I had no quarrel with my dear wife. The whole story is absolutely untrue. I was absent from the house the entire afternoon. Have you anyone who can testify to that? You have my word, said Inglethorpe hastily. The coroner did not trouble to reply. There are two witnesses who will swear to having heard your disagreement with Mrs. Inglethorpe. Those witnesses were mistaken. I was puzzled. The man spoke with such quiet assurance that I was staggered. I looked at Poirot. There was an expression of exultation on his face which I could not understand. Was he at last convinced of Alfred Inglethorpe's guilt? Mr. Inglethorpe, said the coroner, have you heard your wife's dying word repeated here? Can you explain them in any way? Certainly I can. Can you? It seems to me very simple. The room was dimly lighted. Dr. Bauerstein is much of my height and build, and like me wears a beard. In the dim light and suffering as she was, my poor wife mistook him for me. Ah, murmured Poirot to himself, but it is an idea. That. You think it is true? I whispered. I do not say that. It is truly an ingenious supposition. Read my wife's last words as an accusation. Inglethorpe was continuing. They were, on the contrary, an appeal to me. The coroner reflected a moment. Then he said, I believe, Mr. Inglethorpe, that you yourself poured out the coffee and took it to your wife that evening. I poured it out. Yes, but I did not take it to her. I meant to do so, but I was told that a friend was at the hall door, so I laid down the coffee on the hall table. When I came through the hall again a few minutes later, it was gone. This statement might or might not be true, but it did not seem to me to improve matters much for Inglethorpe. In any case, he had ample time to introduced the poison. At that point, Poirot nudged me gently, indicating two men were sitting together near the door. One was a little sharp, dark, ferret faced man, and the other was tall and fair. I questioned Poirot mutely. He put his lips to my ear. Do you know who that little man is? I shook my head. That is Detective Inspector James Japp of Scotland Yard and Jimmy Japp. The other man is from Scotland Yard too. Things are moving quickly, my friend. I stared at the two men intently. There was certainly nothing of the policeman about them. I should never have suspected them of being officially personages. I was still staring when I startled and recalled by the verdict being given. Willful murder against some person or persons unknown. That was the end of chapter 6. Now, it's only half an hour, so we are going to continue to chapter 7. Chapter 7. Poirot pays his debts. As we came out of the stylet's arms, Poirot drew me aside by a gentle pressure of the arm. I understood his object. He was waiting for the Scotland Yard man. In a few minutes they emerged, and Poirot at once stepped forward and accosted the shorter of the two. I fear you do not remember me, Inspector Yap. Why, if it isn't Mr. Poirot, cried the inspector. He turned to the other man. You've heard me speak of Mr. Poirot? It was in 1904. He and I worked together. The Ac- Abercrombie forgery case. You remember? He was run down in Brussels. Oh, those were great days, monsieur. Then you do you remember Baron Altara? There was a pretty rogue for you. He eluded the clutches of all half the police in Europe, but we nailed him in Antwerp, thanks to Mr. Poirot here. As these friendly reminiscences were being indulged in, I drew nearer and was introduced to Detective Inspector Yap, who in his turn introduced us both to his companion, Superintendent Summerhaye. I need hardly ask what you are doing here, gentlemen, remarked Poirot. Yap closed one eye knowingly. No, indeed. Pretty clear case, I should say. But Poirot answered gravely. There I differ from you. Oh, come, said Sommier, opening his lips for the first time. Surely the whole thing is clear as daylight. The man's caught red-handed. How he could be such a fool beats me. But Yap was looking attentively at Poirot. Hold your fire, Summerhay, he remarked jocularly. Me and Monsieur here have met before, and there's no man's judgment I'd sooner take than his. If I am not greatly mistaken, he's got something up in his sleeve. Isn't that so, Monsieur? Poirot smiled. I have drawn certain conclusions, yes. Samaye was still looking rather skeptical, but Yap continued his scrutiny of Poirot. Is this way? He said. So far, we've only seen the case from the outside. That's when the yard's at a disadvantage in a case of this kind, where the murder's only out, so to speak, after the inquest. A lot depends on being on the spot first thing, and that where Mr. Poirot had the start of us. We shouldn't have been here as soon as this event, even if it hadn't been for the fact that there was a smart doctor in the spot who gave us the tip through the coroner. But you've been on the spot from the first, and you might have picked up some little hints from the evidence at the inquest. Mr. Ingelthorp murdered his wife as sure as I stand here, and if anyone but you hinted to the contrary, I'd laugh in his face. I must say I was surprised the jury didn't bring it in a willful murder against him right off. I think they would have if it hadn't been for the coroner. He seemed to be holding them back. Perhaps, though, you have a warrant for his arrest in your pocket now? Suggested Poirot. A kind of wooden shutter of official doom came down on Yap's expression countenance. Perhaps I have, and perhaps I haven't, he remarked dryly. Poirot looked at him thoughtfully. I am very anxious, monsieur, that he should not be arrested. I dare say, observed Sommervieux sarcastically. Yap was regarding Poirot with comical perplexity. Can you go a little further, Mr. Poirot? A wink's as good as not from you. You've been on the spot, and the yard doesn't want to make any mistakes, you know. Poirot nodded gravely. That is exactly what I thought. Well, I will tell you this. Use your warrant. Arrest Mr. Inglethorpe, but it will bring you no goodies. The case against him will be dismissed at once. Comme ça. He snapped his fingers expressively. Yap's face grew grave, though Sommeray gave an incredulous snort. As for me, I was literally dumb with astonishment. I could only conclude that Poirot was mad. Yap had taken out a handkerchief and was gently dabbing his brow. I daren't do it, Mr. Poirot. I'd take your word. But there's others over me who'll be asking what the devil I mean by it. Can't you give me a little more to go on? Poirot reflected a moment. It can be done, he said at last. I admit I do not wish it. It forces my hand. I could have preferred to walk in the dark just for the present, but what you say is very just. The word of a Belgian policeman, whose day is past, is not enough, and Alfred Ingeltorf must not be arrested. That I have sworn, as my friend Hastings here knows. See, then, my good Yap, you go at once to Styles. Well, in about half an hour, we're seeing the coroner at the doctor first. Good. Call me in passing. Last house in the village. I will go with you. At Styles, Mr. Ingerthorpe will give you, or if he refuses, as it probable, I will give you such proofs that shall satisfy you that the case against him could not possibly be sustained. Is that bargain? That's bargain, said Yup heartily. And on behalf of the yard, I am much obliged to you, though I am bound to confess I cannot at present see the faintest possible loophole in the evidence. But you always were a marvel. So long then, monsieur. The two detectives strode away, Sommersby with an incredulous grin on his face. Well, my friend, cried Poirot before I could get a word, what do you think? Mon Dieu! I had some warm moments in that court. I did not figure to myself that the man would be so pig headed as to refuse to say anything at all. Decidedly, it was a policy of an imbecile. Hmm, there's other explanations besides that of imbecility, I remarked. For if the case against him is true, how could he defend himself except by silence? Why, in a thousand ingenious ways, cried Poirot. See, say it is I who have committed the murder. I cannot think of seven post most plausible stories, far more convincing than Mr. Inglethorpe's stony denials. I could not help laughing. My dear Poirot, I'm sure you are capable of thinking of 70. But seriously, in spite of what I've heard you say to the detectives, you surely cannot still believe in the possibility of Alfred Inglethorpe's innocence? Why not? Now as much as before. Nothing has changed, but the evidence is so conclusive. Yes, too conclusive. We turned it in a gate of Lestway's cottage, and proceeded up in the familiar stairs. Yes, yes, too conclusive, continued Poirot almost to himself. Real evidence is usually vague and unsatisfactory. It seems to be examined, sifted, but here the whole thing is cut and dried. No, my friend, this evidence has been very cleverly manufactured, so cleverly that it has defeated its own ends. How do you make that out? Because, so long as the evidence against him was vague, intangible, it was very hard to disprove. But in his anxiety, the criminal has drawn the net so closely that one cut will set Inglethorpe free. I was silent, and in a moment or two Poirot continued. Let us look at the matter like this. Here is a man, let us say, who sets out to poison his wife. He has lived by his wits, as the saying goes. Presumably, therefore, he has some wits. He is not altogether a fool. Well, how does he set about it? He goes boldly to the village chemist and purchases strychnine under his own name, with a trumped up story about a dog, which is bound to be proof absurd. He does not employ the poison that night. No, he waits until he has had a violent quarrel with his wife, or which the whole household is cognizant, and which naturally directs the suspicion upon him. He prepares no defense, no shadow of an alibi. Yet he knows the chemist's assistant must necessarily come forward with the facts. Bah! Do not ask me to believe that any man could do so idiotic. Only a lunatic who wished to commit suicide by causing himself to be hanged would act so. Still, I do not see, I began. Neither do I see, to tell you, mon ami. It puzzles me. Me, Hercule Poirot. But if you believe him innocent, how do you explain his buying the strychnine? Very simply, he did not buy it. But Mace recognized him. I beg your pardon. He saw a man with a black beard like Mr. Inglethorpe's, and wearing glasses like Mr. Inglethorpe's, and dressed in Inglethorpe's rather noticeable clothes. He could not recognize a man whom he had properly only seen in a distance, since, you remember, he himself had only been in the village a fortnight, and Mrs. Inglethorpe dealt principally with Cots in Tadminster. Then you think, mon ami, do you remember the 2 points I laid stress upon? Leave the first one for the moment. And what was the second? The important fact that Alfred Inglethorpe wears peculiar clothes, has a black beard, and uses glasses. I quoted. Exactly. Now, suppose anyone wished to pass himself off as John Cavendish or Lawrence Cavendish. Would it be easy? No, I said thoughtfully. Of course, an actor. But Poirot cut me short ruthlessly. And now, would it not be easy? I will tell you, my friend, because they are both clean shaven men. To make up successfully as one of those two in broad daylight, it would need an actor of genius and a certain initial facial resemblance. But in the case of Alfred Ingelthorpe, all that is changed. His clothes, his beard, and glasses, which hide his eyes, those are the salient points about his personal appearance. Now, that is the first instinct of the criminal, to divert suspicion from himself. It is not so? And how can he be the best to do that? By throwing it on someone else. In this instant, there was a man ready to his hand. Everybody was predisposed to believe Mr. Inglethorpe's guilt. It was a foregone conclusion that he would be suspected. But to make it sure thing must be a tangible proof, such as the actual buying of the poison, and that with a man of the peculiar appearance of Mr. Inglethorpe was not difficult. Remember, this young man Mace had never actually spoken to Mr. Inglethorpe. How should he doubt that the man in his clothes with his birds and his glasses was not Alfred Inglethorpe? It may be so, I said, fascinated by Poirot's eloquence. But if that was the case, why does he not say where he was at 6 o'clock in the Monday evening? Ah, why indeed, said Poirot, calming down. If he were arrested, he probably would speak. But I do not want it to come to that. I must make him see the gravity of his position. There is, of course, something incredible behind his silence. If he did not murder his wife, he is nevertheless a scoundrel, and has nothing something of his own to conceal, quite apart from the murder. What can it be? I mused, won over to Poirot's views, for the moment, although still retaining a faint conviction that the obvious deduction was the correct one. Can you not guess? asked Poirot, smiling. No. Can you? Oh, yes. I had a little idea some time ago. It has turned out to be correct. You never told me, I said reproachfully. Poirot spread out his hands apologetically. Pardon me, mon ami. You were not precisely sympathetic. He turned to me earnestly. I tell you, you see now that he must not be arrested? Perhaps, I said doubtfully, for I was really quite indifferent to the fact of Alfred Inglethorpe and thought that a good fright would do him no harm. Poirot, who was watching me intently, gave a sigh. Come, my friend, he said, changing the subject apart from Mr. Inglethorpe. How did the evidence of the inquest strike you? Oh, pretty much what I expected. Did nothing strike you as peculiar about it? My thoughts flew to Mary Cavendish, and I hedged. In what way? Well, Mr. Lawrence Cavendish's evidence, for instance. I was relieved. How, Lawrence? Oh, Lawrence, no, I don't think so. He's always a nervous chap. His suggestion that his mother might have been poisoned accidentally by means of the tonic she was taking, that did not strike you as strange, Hen? No, I can't say it did. The doctors ridiculed it, of course, but it was quite a natural suggestion for a layman to make. But Monsieur Laurence is not a layman. You told me yourself that he had started by studying medicine and that he had taken his degree. Yes, that's true. I never thought of that. I was rather startled. It is odd. Poirot nodded. From the first, his behavior had been peculiar. Of all the household, he alone would be likely to recognize the symptoms of strychnine poisoning, and yet we find him the only member of the family to uphold strenuously the theory of death from natural cause. If it had been Monsieur John, I could have understood it. He has no technical knowledge and is by nature unimaginative. But Monsieur Laurence, no. And now, today, he puts forward a suggestion that he himself must have known was ridiculous. This was food for thought. In this, mon ami. It's very confusing, I agreed. Then there is Mrs. Cavendish, continued Poirot. That's another who is not telling all she knows. What do you make of her attitude? I don't know what to make of it. It seems inconceivable that she should be shielding Alfred Ingelthorp. Yet that is what it looks like. Poirot nodded reflectively. Yes, it is queer. One thing is certain. She overheard a good deal more of that private conversation than she was willing to admit. And yet she is the last person who would accuse of stooping to the eavesdrop. Exactly. One thing her evidence had shown me. I made a mistake. Dorcas was quite right. The quarrel did not take place earlier in the afternoon, about 4 o'clock, as she said. I looked at him curiously. I had never understood his insistence on that point. Yes, a good deal that was peculiar came out today, continued Poirot. Dr. Bowerstein, now, what was he doing up and dressed at that hour in the morning? Is it astonishing to me that no one commented on that fact? He has insomnia, I believe, I said doubtfully, which is very good for a very bad explanation, remarked Poirot. It covers everything and explains nothing. I shall keep my eye on our clever Dr. Bowerstein. Any more faults to find to this evidence? I inquired satirically. Mon ami, replied Poirot gravely, when you find that people are not telling you the truth, look out. Now, unless I am much mistaken at this inquest today, only one at the most or two persons were speaking the truth without reservation or subterfuge. Oh, come now, Poirot. I won't incite Lawrence or Mrs. Cavendish, but there's John and Mrs. Howard. Surely they were speaking the truth. Both of them, my friend. One I grant you, but both. His words gave me an unpleasant shock. Miss Howard's evidence, unimportant as it was, had been given in such a downright straightforward manner, and it had never occurred to me to doubt her sincerity. Still, I had a great respect for Pharaoh's sagacity, except on the occasions when he was what I described to myself as foolishly pig headed. Do you really think so? I asked. Miss Howard had always seemed to be so essentially honest, almost uncomfortably so. Poirot gave me a curious look, which I could not quite fathom. He seemed to speak and then check himself. Miss Murdoch, too. I continued. There's nothing untruthful about her. No, but it was strange that she never heard a sound, sleeping next door, whereas Mrs. Cavendish, in the other wing of the building, distinctly heard the table fall. Well, she's young. She sleeps soundly. Ah, yes, indeed. She must be a famous sleeper, that one. It did not take like the tone of his voice. I did not take quite the tone of his voice, but at that moment a smart knock reached our ears, and looking out of the window, we perceived the two detectives waiting for us below. Poirot seized his hat, gave a ferocious twist to his moustache, and carefully brushing an imaginary speck of dust from his sleeve, motioned me to precede him down the stairs. There we joined the detectives and set out for Styles. I think the appearance of the two Scotland Yard men was rather shock. especially to John, though, of course, after the verdict, he had realized it was only a matter of time. Still, the presence of the detectives brought the truth home to him more than everything else could have done. Poirot had conferred with Japp in a low tone on the way up, and it was the latter functionary who requested that the household, with the exception of the servants, should be assembled together in the drawing room. I realized the significance of this. It was up to Poirot to make good to his boast. Personally, I was not sanguine. Poirot might have excellent reason for his belief in Ingelthorpe's innocence, but a man of the type of Summerhay would require tangible proof, and this I doubted if Poirot could supply. Before very long, we had all trooped into the drawing room, and the door for which Yap closed. Poirot politely set chair for everyone. Scotland Yard men were the cynosure of all eyes. I think that for the first time we realized that the thing was not a bad dream, but a tangible reality. We had had we had read for such things. Now we ourselves were actors in the drama. Tomorrow, the daily papers will all over England will blossom and out to news in stirring headlines. Mysterious tragedy in Essex. Wealthy lady poisoned. There would be pictures of styles, snapshots of the family leaving the inquest. The village photographer had not been idle. All the things that one had read 100 times, things that happened to other people, not to oneself. And now in this house, a murder had been committed. In front of us were the detectives in charge of the case. The well known glib phraseology passed rapidly through my mind in the interval before Poirot opened the proceedings. I think everyone was a little surprised that it should be he, not one of the official detectives, who took the initiative. Madame and Monsieur, said Poirot, bowing as though he were a celebrity about to deliver a lecture. I have asked you to come here all together for a certain object. That object would concern Mr. Inglethorpe's. Inglethorpe was sitting a little by himself. I think unconsciously everyone had drawn his chair slightly away from him, and he had a faint start as Poirot pronounced his name. Mr. Inglethorpe, said Poirot, addressing him directly, a very dark shadow is resting on this house, and the shadow of murder. Inglethorpe shook his head sadly. My poor wife, he murmured. Poor Emily. It is terrible. I do not think, monsieur, said Poirot pointedly, that you quite realize how terrible it might be for you. And as Inglethorpe did not appear to understand, he added, Mr. Inglethorpe, you are standing in a very grave danger. The two detectives fidgeted. I saw the official caution. Anything you say will be used in evidence against you. Actually hovering on Summerhaye's lips, Poirot went on. Do you understand now, monsieur? No, what do you mean? I mean, said Poirot deliberately, that you are suspected of poisoning your wife. A little gust ran through the circle of this plain speaking. Good heavens! Cried Inglethorpe, starting up. What a monstrous idea! I poison my dearest Emily? I do not think, Poirot watched him narrowly, that you quite realize the unfavorable nature of your evidence at the inquest. Mr. Inglethorpe's knowing what I have now told you, Do not still refuse to say. Do you still refuse to say where you were at 6 o'clock on Monday afternoon? With a groan, Alfred Ingelthorp sank down again and buried his face in his hands. Poirot approached and stood over him. Speak, he cried menacingly. With an effort, Ingelthorp raised his face from his hands. Then slowly and deliberately he shook his head. You will not speak? No, I do not believe that anyone could be so monstrous as to accuse me of what you say. Poirot nodded thoughtfully, like a man whose mind is made up. Swah, he said. Then I must speak for you. Alfred Inglethorpe sprang up again. You? How can you speak? You do not know? He broke off abruptly. Poirot turned to his face as, Madame and Monsieur, I speak. Listen. I, Hercule Poirot, affirm that the man who entered the chemist's shop and purchased strychnine at 6 o'clock on Monday last was not Mr. Inglethorpe's, for at 6 o'clock on that day, Mr. Inglethorpe was escorting Mrs. Raikes back to her home from a neighboring farm. I can produce no less than 5 witnesses to swear to having seen them together, either at 6 or just after, and as you may know, the Abbey Farm, Mrs. Raikes' home, is at least 2.5 miles distant from the village. There is absolutely no question as to the alibi. And that was the end of chapter 7 from this book, The Mysterious Affair at Styles. And I would like to thank you for watching and for reading with me. If you enjoyed this video, please like and leave a lovely comment. If you really enjoyed it, please subscribe and click the notification bell. You will then be notified when I post a new video. I would like to thank you for all your emails, your gifts, and tips. I love to read all your comments, so please keep it coming. For those who have bought me a coffee, thank you. If you want to buy me a coffee, the link is in the description below. If you want to message me directly, please send me an email at ann.vanhofstede@gmail.com. The link is also in the description below. Again, please look at my other videos. Persuasion by Jane Austen. I've read The History of England by Jane Austen. And please tell your friends and family about this channel. Thank you so much for all your support. This channel would not be noticed or seen without your support. See you on my next video. Goodbye.